I'd like to begin by thanking Timothy Ong for inviting me to this event. We had dinner in Singapore together 4 weeks ago, and when he told me that he possibly needed a speaker for a conference in Myanmar, I found that a temptation very, very difficult to resist. And to come here today and yesterday and learn about the very exciting developments going on in this country has been truly a very positive and very awesome experience. So thanks again, Timothy, for inviting me to come here. My assignment this afternoon is to talk about the U.S. economy, and in particular what the re-election of President Obama means for the U.S. economy over the next few years. And I guess the first point I want to make in opening is the recent election we had 4 weeks ago very much reaffirmed the status quo we've had for the last 2 years. We have a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, and a Republican House of Representatives. And this does create the danger of gridlock, because our two major political parties are very, very far apart on some fundamental issues of taxation and public spending, and they will find it very hard to resolve these disagreements. We currently have probably the most polarized political system we've had in over 120 or 130 years. Both parties have become very, very rigid, very partisan, very divided. 4 years ago, we had 55 so-called blue dog Democrats. They were centrists, they were conservatives, who could possibly do deals with the other party. We're now down to only 15 blue dog Democrats. On the Republican side as well, the number of centrists and moderates has fallen very sharply. We now have 75 or 80 members of the House caucus who call themselves members of the so-called Tea Party. And the Tea Party is very firmly opposed to many tax increases, very firmly opposed to many different areas of public spending. So we do have, at the current time, a very, very polarized political system. Now, the first issue confronting this political system over the next 3 or 4 weeks is the issue of the so-called fiscal cliff. 2 years ago, the President and the Congress agreed on very major tax cuts. They agreed to extend the so-called Bush tax cuts, first enacted back in 2003, for 2 more years. They also brought in a payroll tax cut, cutting our Social Security tax by 2%. That was worth about $120 billion for the household sector. They also agreed to extend unemployment benefits for those suffering from long-term unemployment for 1 more year. So we had, in 2010, a very, very aggressive program of extending or offering new tax cuts. And all of these tax cuts will expire at the end of this year. And if they do expire, we will have, starting in January, a $500 billion tax increase on the American people. And the Congressional Budget Office in Washington estimates this will drive the American economy back into recession during the first half of next year and possibly drive the unemployment rate back to 9% from just under 8% at the current time. This could be a truly catastrophic scenario. And the only way we can avoid this scenario is for Republicans and Democrats to agree on some program to postpone or defer these tax increases into the future. The problem we have, though, is they can't agree on how to do this. Republicans want to extend the tax cuts for everyone for as long as possible. President Obama, by contrast, wants to increase income taxes on Americans earning over $250,000 a year. He's been lobbying for this for 4 years, and he's finally determined to have it occur in the year 2013. So on this issue, we have a very fundamental disagreement. Back in July, I was in Washington, so I went down to the White House to get their thoughts on this issue, on the danger of the fiscal cliff. I spoke to quite high-level officials like Gene Sperling. In the afternoon, I went down to Capitol Hill and talked to Paul Ryan's chief economist. Paul Ryan was, a few weeks ago, the Republican vice presidential candidate. Both sides promised me the fiscal cliff would not be allowed to happen, but they could not tell me how they'd reach a compromise on these disagreements. They simply said the fiscal cliff is so dangerous and so threatening, we must find some way to avoid it. So right now, we're now locked in negotiations. Now, what's happened over the last 2 weeks is the Republicans have begun to talk about the possibility of a tax increase, but they don't want to raise marginal income tax rates. What they want to do instead is possibly curtail tax allowances. In America, you can write off a variety of tax expenditures against your personal tax liability. You can deduct your mortgage interest. You can deduct charitable contributions. You can deduct your state and local taxes. And the government also classifies your health insurance from your employer as tax-free. And those are quite large numbers now. For the average American family, their health insurance is worth $15,000 per annum, and this income is classified as tax-free. Republicans have not yet indicated exactly how they'd curtail allowances, but my best guess is they would not eliminate individual allowances, they would simply cap their value. If, for example, they cap the value of tax allowances at $25,000 per household, they could raise $94 billion. They could also lower the tax rate at which these tax expenditures are allowed to accrue. Rather than having your tax expenditures occur at the top marginal tax rate of 35%, or if Obama's successful, 40%, you might cap it only at 28%. If you did that, you could raise $300 billion of revenue. So anyway, these ideas are currently in play, but there is not yet a firm plan. All we're doing at the current time is exploring different ideas. And for the Republicans, this issue is very, very difficult because 95% of the Republican members of Congress have signed a pledge in recent years promising to never raise taxes under any circumstances. And these Republicans fear if they do vote for a tax increase in the next few weeks, they will face opposition in 2 years' time in their primary election from other Republicans, more conservative Republicans, and they would be in great danger of losing their seats. So Republicans are suffering very much from a fear factor of what could happen to them from members of their own party. And this is making it very, very difficult for the Republican leadership to carry their own caucus, their own backbenchers, on the possibility of a tax increase. Republicans also want, in return for tax increases, large and substantive cuts in the big entitlement programs, government spending on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the big transfer payment programs. And Democrats have a hard time on this issue. Many of the Democrats sought re-election last year promising to never tamper with these transfer payment programs. So for the Democrats, this is the difficult issue. How do you rein in the growth of Medicare spending, Medicaid spending, Social Security? And Medicare is a very special challenge because Medicare, with an aging population, is increasing very rapidly. And it could, over the next 30 or 40 years, go from being only 4% of GDP to 13 or 14%. A truly dramatic increase in government spending that would have very far-reaching consequences for the U.S. economy. So on both taxes and entitlement spending, we do have, in each party, major disagreements. And my fear is they'll find it very difficult to reach an agreement over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And what it may take to break this gridlock is a stock market crash. That the market will decide in 2 weeks they can't do a deal, we're going to have a recession, and the market could then fall several hundred points. And this would then force them to finally reach an agreement. The precedent for this is what happened back in September of 2008. Right after Lehman Brothers failed, Hank Paulson offered a program of several $100 billion to rescue the U.S. banking system. The Senate passed it immediately. The House defeated it. The following day, the stock market fell 800 points. Within 24 hours, the House agreed to pass the program. A stock market crash did frighten the Republicans into realizing they had no choice. And it may take similar drama, similar excitement to also overcome this gridlock that we have at the current time. And if we had the stock market crash, Republican members could then say to their voters, I was forced by a crashing stock market to vote for a tax increase. I don't want to do it, I don't like it, I'm sorry, but I really had no alternative. And their belief is, under those circumstances, the Republican primary opponents would not be able to defeat them in the elections in 2 years' time. So we're very much now, therefore, at a very, very critical turning point. And how this plays out will very much define Obama's first year in office. And the odds are he will get a tax increase on high-income people. What we don't know right now is exactly how it will be structured. Will it be a marginal tax rate going from 35 to 40%, or will it be a reduction in these various tax allowances? We won't know the answer to that question for at least 2 more weeks. And the same goes for the entitlement programs. These are critical to the long-term solvency of the U.S. government. We will have to get out of these negotiations some kind of agreement for meaningful reduction in spending going out 5 or 10 years. And looming as well in the first quarter is the issue of the so-called debt ceiling. The Congress has to vote every 12 or 18 months to increase the amount of debt the U.S. government can sell. We had a confrontation on this back in August of last year. We came right down to a situation where the Treasury almost lost the ability to borrow. This created a concern the Treasury might then default on the debt. And finally, at the last minute, they agreed on a compromise to basically sequester $1 trillion of government spending over the next 2 years in return for increasing the debt ceiling, and to also create a special committee to look for other long-term solutions. That special committee met in October and September of 2011, but it could not reach any further agreements. It left us still with a gridlock. With the debt ceiling issue looming again in February, that will again increase the pressure on both sides to look for long-term solutions to the American deficit problem. What we really will have to have over the next 6 or 8 weeks is some kind of grand bargain to both resolve the fiscal cliff and also meet the challenge of the debt ceiling. And the danger, if we can't work out effective solutions over the next 6 or 8 weeks, is there'll be a further downgrade in the U.S. credit rating. S&P cut the U.S. credit rating in August of last year. Moody's and Fitch are still making up their mind about what to do. But if we don't get out of all these negotiations effective long-term solutions to the American deficit problem, I do think the odds are very high that Moody's will, in the first quarter, also cut the U.S. credit rating from AAA to AA.